Well, welcome back, I guess, is the right way to say that. Again, I'm going with this recorded format. Enjoyed the feedback I got from several of y'all last week, letting me know that you really kind of enjoyed this layout. I enjoy having this thing behind me, helping me do some references, and I really like having kind of an outside quote up each week. One, it forces me to do a little more reading, which is always nice, and two, I think it provides some point of connection for our time in the study. So, as you probably know by now, we've been working our way through the Gospel of Matthew over the last several months, I think at this point, with a few breaks in there for different activities and events. We are still in the Sermon on the Mount, though we are bringing our time in the Sermon on the Mount to a close, and that is an important thing to kind of keep in mind as we work our way through this week and next week. The last 2 weeks we'll spend in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is winding up his thoughts and beginning to offer some summaries. Tonight kind of starts that transition, though he's still doing a good bit of teaching, and next week is full-on kind of conclusion and thoughts to this group that he's speaking to. So by way of reminder, I remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is talking specifically to his disciples about discipleship. Now, there is certainly a crowd around, but it starts by recognizing two kind of different groups that are present. There are the disciples, and then there are the crowds. And it says Jesus called his disciples together while surrounded by the crowds and began to teach them. I think, modifying the disciples, not necessarily the crowds. The crowds are certainly invited to hear. And it is in some ways an invitation to discipleship for them. And it is all about discipleship. So I've got right over here this kind of list, breakdown of the Sermon on the Mount that I've been doing along the way verbally, but now that I have a space to kind of write it down, it provides a pretty good kind of summary of the different sections and what they have to say about discipleship. And Jesus starts by letting know that becoming a disciple changes your perspective. It changes how you see your own experiences in the world around you. And then he goes on to explain why discipleship matters. And then for a pretty good section, he talks about how discipleship changes our relationships with friends, enemies, everyone. And then the last section, really 6:1 could go all the way to 7:13, talking about how discipleship changes what we value. But I think there's a little bit of nuance there that I wanted to tease out. So chapter 6 really looks at discipleship and how it changes what we value. And then chapter 7, the first half, really looks at how discipleship changes how we value. And I know that's a bit of a weird phrase, and I'll do my best to explain it. But I think it will become somewhat apparent as we work our way through the text this evening, how that comes to pass. So let's go ahead and just dive in. Try to go a little bit quicker this evening. I really try to keep these videos to about the 20-minute mark. I know some of you don't care, but for those of you who don't care if I do a 35 or 40-minute video, there are others who really prefer them in the 5-minute mark. And so this nice middle ground, I think, ends up being pretty good for me. So here we go, chapter 7 of Matthew. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, "Let me help you, get rid of that speck in your eye," when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck that is in your friend's eye. Don't waste what is whole. Oh, I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I think there's a split that most translations don't follow, but actually should be. So, verses 1 through 5, talking about judging others and how important the standard by which we judge is. Now, there are a few things that I want to point out here too. One, Jesus is not encouraging us away from discernment. In fact, the little example about logs and specks seems to encourage one, we examine ourselves first, but then we do some examining of others. We are supposed to encourage and help each other live, more faithfully in a community. Part of what I do is discerning what I think the body needs at any given point, and then trying to tailor teaching around that. And part of that is making some judgment calls. But I think there's a difference between making judgment calls and what we get translation here wise as judging. And the reason I say that is because the word in the Greek that's translated here, judge, can have a pretty wide, my hands aren't on screen, I gotta go narrow. It's a pretty wide range of meaning. Everywhere from pronouncing judgment in court to, making decisions between options in front of you, to straight up condemnation. And I think, given how strongly Jesus words so much of his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, that what Jesus intends here is the strongest interpretation of that word. And some translations do a good job of picking this up. I want to say the New Revised Standards. One of them, do not condemn and you will not be condemned. And it's that idea that there's a difference between making judgment calls about what is good, right, and healthy, and offering encouragement to others along the way, and destroying relationships with people because of your own versions of judgment calls. And the reason I think that's an important marker is, one, we have an incredible ability to be wrong. At least I know that personally, and, as somebody who makes judgment calls about other people, I know that about people. We have an ability to get things wrong. And I wonder what sort of damage some of our condemnations might bring if we find out down the road we were using a measuring stick that was inaccurate. And I think Jesus kind of keeps that in front of us as a very real possibility throughout the Sermon on the Mount. The whole "you have heard it said, but now I say" leaves open this possibility of us human beings for a long period of time holding a standard that does not turn out to be proper, valuable, helpful, holy. And so, Jesus warns against condemnation, the cutting off of relationship and the cutting off of others, or the pronouncement of someone else's certain evilness. And then he pushes it back on us, because what he warns about is the standard by which we use. And there's a way to read this that I think is not true to its intent, but has been pretty popular for a number of years. And that's the humanistic perspective that says, well, if you judge generously, you will impart on others the desire to judge you generously. But I don't think Jesus is at all concerned here about us ensuring that people are nice back to us. And in fact, the sermon starts with this recognition that just because you are nice does not mean others will be nice to you. Instead, what Jesus here is talking about is a bigger kingdom perspective. It's not do not judge others and those others will not judge you, or do not judge others and nobody will judge you. It is this recognition that if you spend your life rapidly and freely condemning anyone and everyone who doesn't agree with you, you will along the way destroy, wreck shop on God's intent for how you are supposed to live, thereby bringing judgment upon yourself. Instead, if you live with discernment, but also a willingness to engage in relationship with others, you may find that very graciousness is the graciousness that God has. It's just difficult when what we want is some sort of tangible, real-world outcome. If I do good things, I get good things. Of course, the Bible reminds us over and over that that's simply not how the world works. And Jesus is pointing, I think, to a much bigger idea of condemnation and forgiveness here. And then the verse that I think we should probably all spend more time with on a daily basis, verses 3 through 5, of planks and specks. So One of the things you'll hear me say relatively often from the pulpit, I think I've done it in these classes, is that there is an expectation of self-discernment that is embedded into the heart of Christianity. We are supposed to think about our own journey of faith, how faithful we are being, where sin exists in our lives. Like, those are things we are supposed to be aware of. But Jesus presents this image in this story. So maybe this is the right way to do it. I remember at Leadership Training for Christ as a kid, a long time ago, and I want to say I was probably in junior high or high school. I don't think I was in high school yet. I want to say I was in junior high, maybe elementary school. One of the dramas for Matthew that year was a group that took on this passage. And they acted out what it was like to have somebody with a giant chunk of wood sticking out of their face, trying to then go in and deal with this small piece that was in somebody's eye. It was really funny because they did a good job of setting it all up. And every time he'd turn around, he'd end up whacking somebody in the head. The whole room was aware of the log in his eye. The only person who didn't seem to function as if it was there was the person who had it attached to their face. And that kind of silly image acted out has stuck with me because the absurdity of seeing it brought to life the absurdity of it happening. And yet I think this is something that happens relatively often, where we are more than happy to sit back and pass harsh judgment on how terrible some other person or group of people, anyone who thinks this way or is, while never considering the ways in which we live reveal, planks in our own eye. And so what Jesus wants his disciples to do before they go after others for their issues is to be sure they are cognizant of their own sinfulness and struggle. And Jesus is going to reinforce this here in a few minutes in another passage that we're going to look at. And then I think verse 6 really starts the next section. We've tried to read it as if it's a part of this first section, some allegory or some summary of what Jesus is talking about in the first 5 verses, but I think it really pertains more to what comes next. Jesus says in verse 6, "Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to the pigs. They will trample the pearls and then turn and attack you." Now, if you're following along in a different translation, it probably says something to the effect of, don't give the sacred to dogs. Don't give what is holy to dogs. My translation has tried to apply that a little bit, but there's a bigger application, I think, than any translation can hit in just those few words. Because that phrase, "don't give what is holy," has a very specific biblical connotation. It means something. If you look at the Old Testament, what is holy refers to meat that's been sacrificed to God. That phrase is attached to the sacred consistently throughout the Old Testament. And the sacrificial meat had specific purposes. Depending on the sacrifice, it went some to the family, some to the priest, but it had specific uses and specific ways it had to be eaten. And so what Jesus offers up here is an image of somebody taking, meat that has been sacrificed to God off the altar and throwing it out in the wild. Dogs were not family pets, especially amongst the Jewish people at the time. Nor is this some allegory talking about Gentiles. It's not that either. Jesus is providing an image that makes perfect sense in their culture, where you've taken, sacrificial meat and cast it aside. And the reason I say that is because dogs were wild. Think of coyotes, wolves, feral dogs, something along those lines. And so the only way they get their paws and teeth on what is sacred is if it has been thrown aside. So Jesus is saying, don't throw aside what comes from God. Don't throw aside what is sacred. It's not about people specifically, which I think is if you read, I think it matters how we read it. Jesus is talking about wisdom, the good things that come from God. Don't set it aside. Same thing with pearls to pigs. Don't take the good thing and cast it out. If you throw pearls into a pig pen, they're going to get absolutely trampled under. And that interesting phrase, and then they turn and attack you, hasn't been my experience with pigs. Maybe ancient pigs were a little bit different. Usually, if I was in my friend's pig pen, they were coming to figure out what treats we had for them. But again, Jesus is talking about the danger of throwing out, what is from God. And then he turns to prayer, which is why I think that verse 6 really goes with what comes next, not what comes before it. He says, keep on asking and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking and you will find. Keep on knocking and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds. To everyone who knocks, the door will be open. You parents, if your children ask you for a loaf of bread, do you give them a stone instead? Or if they ask for a fish, do you give them a snake? Of course not. So if you, sinful people, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to you? Will give good gifts to those who ask him. Do unto others whatever you would have them do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. Verse 12 is really our pivot verse there, the last one we just read, and we will start with it again next week. In fact, I just realized I wrote the wrong number up here, so let me go ahead and correct a mistake. Whoop, there we go. Live editing. There we go. So what we see here, because Jesus made teaching on prayer the center of the Sermon on the Mount. Remember what we call the Lord's Prayer is right stock in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. But he circles back to it. And if you've heard this verse translated traditionally, usually it's something along the lines of ask and you shall receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. But that translation leaves out the tense of the verb. Sorry for those of y'all who don't like to nerd out on literary stuff. Is really continual. So the New Living, which I'm using here, is saying keep on, keep on, keep on. Recognizes that what Jesus says here is that these actions from people of faith towards God are supposed to be continuous and ongoing. And so by that, I just want to remind you that prayer is not like a grocery list that you put before God and say, hey, can you fill this? It's not a pickup order that we put in. Instead, it is something prayer is something that is active. It should move us to act on our prayers. It should make us aware and active in our faith. It's one of those things where there's a difference between seeing somebody in need on the corner and praying, God, please help fill those needs, and then going about your day and doing nothing about it. But there is an aspect of prayer, I think, that should cause us to realize that God has put us, if we are indeed at that point, in a position to help. And at some point, it is that change in us, in how we value and how we perceive the world and what we have in the world, that should change how we interact with people who are around us. And I think when Jesus talks about prayer here, that makes perfect sense. Now, that's not to say that God does not also respond by giving. And the second half of what we just read certainly pertains to that. You parents, if your children ask for bread, how many of you would give them a stone instead? Or if they ask for fish, give them a snake? One, we now know what typical Galilean diet was made up of. I would do fine. Lindsay wouldn't do so great. Give me bread and fish all day, and I'll be the happiest person in the world. She's good with bread, not a huge fan of fish. But there's this recognition here that there's a gap between the holiness of God and, our ability to be perfect as human beings, and even us as flawed and, somewhat fallen people would never consider for a moment giving our kid a rock to eat when they've asked for bread, as some sort of real nutritious, here, eat this. Or the same for fish and snakes. It's just not something that people do. Now, sure, there are exceptions to that rule of parents who have been... certainly that wasn't so much the case in Jesus' day. And I think there's an argument to be said that just because we read something generally doesn't mean we should apply it specifically. But that's a different conversation for a different day. What Jesus is trying to point out here is, why would you think that God is going to give you terrible things if you're asking for good? You wouldn't do that as a parent to your kid. Why would you think that for a second that God would do that to you? How much more so does your Heavenly Father give good gifts? And so Jesus is just kind of, I think, winding up the teaching section of this sermon before he kind of pivots to final application by reminding people that God gives good things to them. And I think that may be an important thing for us to remember as well. But I think the other side of that for us to remember is that sometimes the way that God gives good things to other people is through us. There are ways in which we are the answers to others' prayers. And I think that's both a challenge and important to remember, and I think definitely true in context here of Jesus' teaching and what we've looked at today. And then finally, the pivot verse. Do unto others what you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. And I think really verse 12 goes with what comes next more than it does this, but it's, to me, the pivot verse as Jesus turns, and a good place to wrap up this time and start next time. This is a very common idea in Jewish teaching around the time of Jesus. Jesus didn't invent this phrase. It predates him by some amount of time. Several other rabbis from 100 years before Jesus were known to have said different versions of this. And what Jesus is doing is reminding people that how you treat others matters. And it says something about you. It says something about the depth of your faith. It shows, it reveals. And then that final statement, this is the essence of what is taught in the law and the prophets, to me is perfect. Because what Jesus has been working with here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 really is the law and the prophets. Jesus is not scrapping sacred literature. He's not throwing out what we now call the Old Testament. He's not throwing out Jewish scripture and teaching. He's trying to help everyone understand the purpose of it when lived out and how it shows up in your life and how it interacts with the lives of others. And so Jesus is saying this rule is the essence of the law and the prophets. It's the essence of what I'm teaching you. It is the heart of what I want you to learn. All right. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up right there. Next time we will pick up there where we move off. I just realized that I didn't take the time when I got started. I think I referenced that there was a quote there on the wall, but I didn't read it off, and I know it can be difficult to read because, one, my handwriting isn't great, and two, you're looking at this on a screen of I don't know how small. So what I wrote up there tonight, which I think connects to the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, though maybe not quite as applicable directly to the verses we looked at this week as the verse that I shared last week. It is a quote on forgiveness from a guy named Miroslav Volf, who I really like. From his book, Free of Charge, Giving and Forgiving in a Culture Stripped of Grace. And one, great book, worth a read. But the quote that I want to share with you, forgiveness doesn't stand alone, rather it is embedded in a way of life that is committed to overcoming evil by doing good. I think that connects very well with the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. How we live shows up in how we treat others, whether that's in forgiveness or in condemnation. I think when we live lives that truly are committed to overcoming evil by doing good, then it shows up in our daily interactions with others. All right, glad you were with us this evening, even though I'm recording this at 11 something in the morning. And we'll continue on in this format. If it works for you, it really works for me. We'll continue on and close up the Sermon on the Mount next Wednesday night. See you then.